Well, good morning and welcome back to Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. I'm Scott Fisher and I'm glad you've chosen to study with me this morning. We've been looking at the transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant for the past several weeks. And I would encourage you, if you've missed one of those episodes, go back and watch it so that you can be caught up and understand how we're getting to where we've gotten to. Now, this transition period was for the 40 years between the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, around 30 A.D., to the 70 A.D. destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Now, we've seen that Paul's teaching focused on Gentile believers. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. And many of the Gentiles were being pressured to embrace the practice of Old Covenant Judaism as necessary for salvation. Now, it's important to understand the context of his writings. Every Gentile city that Paul went into, he first went to the synagogue in an attempt to persuade Jews that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Covenant promise to the fathers and that his crucifixion and resurrection proved him to be their Messiah. But Paul's real focus was on reaching Gentiles with the gospel because he understood that the promise made to the fathers was going to open the way to God to all people everywhere. And Paul viewed his ministry and the ingathering of Gentiles as a major prophetic fulfillment. As we've seen, the grafting in of Gentile believers among Jewish believers and the two groups becoming one new man is the mystery of God that was revealed to the Apostle Paul. And Paul had to point out that Jewish law keepers, that as holy as they think they are, they in fact are as stained by sin as the most pagan of Gentiles. At the same time, in preaching the grace and forgiveness of God to the Gentiles, they had to be instructed in the ministry of righteousness and what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus, which includes loving even your enemies and even your persecutors. Now, I want you to join me in Ephesians chapter 2. We're going to pick it up at verse 11. Paul writes this, "Therefore, remember that you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands, remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and you were strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." Now, folks, that was the plight of all Gentiles at the time, and frankly, it is the plight of the whole world today outside of Christ. Verse 13, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace," now look at this, "who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two groups into one new man, thus establishing peace, and that he might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having put to death the enmity." Now, this concept of joining together Jew and Gentile during this transition period of the Old Covenant to the New Covenant was revolutionary. Neither group really cared for the other. The Jews considered it unlawful to even visit with a Gentile, much less have social contact. The Gentiles knew what the Jews thought of them, and they mocked and even hated the Jews. Now, Paul comes along and is telling both groups that in Jesus the Messiah, they are being combined into one new man. Well, not without intense conflict. After addressing the importance of the two groups becoming one, Paul then explains the necessary character of Christ that they're to walk in. And we pick it up in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. Therefore, I, Paul, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called. How? Verse 2, with all humility and gentleness, with patience. Now look at this, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Now this unity of the Spirit is addressing the unity between these two disparate groups of Jews and Gentiles who profess belief in Jesus as the Messiah. To bring about an end to the ongoing contention between them. That has, at the time Paul writes this letter, it's been going on for nearly 25 years after the crucifixion. Now, in the next 3 verses, notice how many times Paul uses the word one. Verse 4, there is one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. 7 times he reminds them of the oneness that Jewish believers and Gentile believers are called to. Paul calls the Jews to recognize the glory of the new covenant that is surpassing the glory of the old covenant. They had to recognize that there is nothing that the practice of Judaism contributed or contributes toward their salvation. And in fact, if they refuse to acknowledge the surpassing glory of the new covenant of faith in Jesus, they were going to die in their sin. But Paul also calls upon the Gentile followers of Jesus, many who had come to faith out of pure paganistic lifestyles. And they must lay aside their former manner of life and put on the nature and character of Christ. And we pick it up in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. Now notice these words. So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality. Now look at this, for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. Now verse 20, but you did not learn Christ in this way, if indeed you've heard of him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in, now look at this, this is the new man, has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. So here's the heart, excuse me, here's the heart of the Jew-Gentile conflict taking place during the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. Jewish believers had to let go of the practice of Judaism, circumcision, observance of dietary laws, focus on bloodline, discrimination toward Gentiles, etc., etc. At the same time, Gentiles had to learn what it looked like to live in the spirit of righteousness. They had to learn what it looked like to be a follower of Jesus and forsaking their former manner of life. As we close this morning study, once again, we have to be reminded that the old covenant came to an end with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that means that the new covenant era, the kingdom, the promise made to the fathers, the heavenly Jerusalem also came. And you and I, through faith in Jesus, are made citizens of his kingdom, and everything that was lost in Eden is now restored in Christ. We have unhindered access to the presence of God. We have the glory of Jesus, and we are ambassadors of his kingdom, inviting all people everywhere to experience the life-transforming encounter and life with him. And that is the good news. Amen? Well, I want to thank you for studying with me again this morning. And if what I'm sharing with you goes against what you've always believed, don't be afraid or intimidated. Let the scriptures be your source. And we'll be picking up right here again tomorrow morning, and we'll be continuing our study of the truth of the Messianic kingdom. I want to thank you for joining me for Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. And I hope you'll continue to join me Tuesday mornings through Friday mornings each week right here. Now, why not click on the subscribe button on the lower right corner of your screen, and you'll be notified in YouTube whenever a new video gets posted. And if you're watching on Facebook, consider sharing this on your wall and invite your friends to watch it. And if you saw it on Twitter, retweet it and encourage your friends to watch. And if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, why not join me on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. for Tuesday Nights in the Word. That's right, during June and July, we're meeting on Tuesday nights. Hey, come out and join us. And I hope you'll go out and make today a great day.